This video, I will present to you some cases which suggest that Frege's view of communication seems to be correct, and that Russell's proposal that all that matters for successful communication is sameness of reference. These cases suggest that that view, Russell's view, is incorrect. These cases are discussed in Heck's paper, and they go back to, or they're at least first emphasized by a paper, Brian Lohr in 1976, and also the supplementary reading by Anne Bezuidenhout also discusses these cases. Okay, so these cases suggest intuitively that Russell's view is incorrect. And so I'm going to present a couple of these cases and then give an argument on the basis of these cases against direct reference theory. Okay, first case. Imagine that John and Sally are at home in the evening watching TV and discussing a man, M. So we're not going to name this man, but we're just going to call this man M, who they're discussing. This man M they're discussing, John and Sally they both know this man, from their train commute. Okay, so John and Sally live together and take the train to commute to work together, and there's a man they frequently see on the commute, and they're talking about him. And also the TV is on in the background. Okay. Now, out of coincidence, this man M shows up on the TV. Okay, so let's imagine that they're watching the news on the TV, and the newscaster happens to be interviewing this man for some reason. Okay? But the thing is, neither John nor Sally realize that the person they're seeing being interviewed on the TV is the person from their train commute who they are talking about. So John notices, so neither of them realize that it's the same person who they're talking about currently. But nonetheless, John starts watching the TV and comes to think that the man he sees on the TV is well dressed. So he communicates that to Sally as follows. He says, "That man is well dressed." And he kind of gestures at the TV. Okay, so John is talking about the man he sees on the TV and thinks of him that he is well dressed, and says, using the demonstrative, that the man he sees on the TV is well dressed. Now, Sally doesn't realize that John has started paying attention to the TV, and she thinks that they're still talking about as the man. She thinks that they are continuing their conversation about the man on the train. And so Sally interprets John this way and agrees with John. And so Sally forms a belief that she would express, "That man on our commute is well dressed." Okay? So what we can say about this case is that John and Sally are thinking of the same object as referent. Okay, M. So John is thinking of the man he sees on the TV as that man, and Sally is thinking of the man on their commute as that man. And that, as I've said, is the same person, though they don't realize it. Okay? So John, in speaking, and Sally, in understanding him, are actually thinking of the same object, M, as the referent of the demonstrative, that man. But intuitively, there isn't successful communication in this case. Intuitively, it seems that Sally has misinterpreted John in thinking that they are still talking about the man as seen on their commute. So, in this case, we have a singular term, in this case, the demonstrative that man used, and we have the speaker and hearer thinking of the same object as referent. However, there is not successful communication. It seems that there has been a misunderstanding. So, and it seems like what is wrong, or it seems like what has gone wrong, is that John and Sally are not thinking of the referent in similar enough ways, or John and Sally are thinking of the referent in very different ways. And so even though they are thinking of the same referent, they're thinking of that referent in very different ways. So John is thinking of the referent as the man on the TV, and Sally is thinking of the referent as the man from their commute. And so these very different ways of thinking of the same referent is the reason why John and Sally are not communicating successfully. So, and this is a problem for Russell's view of communication because, again, Russell thought that all that was required for successful communication was that the interlocutors are thinking of the same object as referent. However, here we have a case where the interlocutors are thinking of the same object as referent, but intuitively there doesn't seem to be successful communication. Here's another case, and this is taken or inspired by a case which Perry gives and which I have mentioned before. So suppose that John and Sally are facing a large body of water. Now there's a large building between them and the water. Okay. From the left side of the building, a bow of a ship protrudes. From the right side, a stern. John and Sally do not realize that the bow and stern are of the same ship, the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. Okay, now imagine Sally utters the following. That ship is an aircraft carrier. And in making this utterance and using the demonstrative that ship, Sally points to the bow. Now, suppose that as a result of John's focus on the stern, and perhaps the way that Sally's demonstration looks from his perspective, John actually thinks that Sally is pointing at the stern. So, and in this case, we imagine John agrees with Sally, and John forms the belief that he would express with that ship pointing to the stern is an aircraft carrier. So here it seems that John has misinterpreted Sally because, again, John and Sally do not realize that the bow and the stern are the bow and the stern of the same ship. Okay? Now, when Sally points at the bow saying that ship is an aircraft carrier, and John misinterprets her demonstration and thinks that she is pointing to the stern, it seems that John hasn't correctly understood what she's saying. And furthermore, intuitively, John has not understood what Sally is saying, even if the bow and the stern, as we've stipulated, are of the same ship. So again, we have a case where both interlocutors are thinking of the same object as reference, the ship, but because they end up thinking of this object as referent in very different ways, it seems like there is not understanding or successful communication. Therefore, this case also suggests is that successful communication with a singular term requires more than that the interlocutors simply think of the same referent. They have to think of the referent in similar ways or appropriately related ways. Okay, I'm not going to talk through the details of this third case, but what you can do is look at the handout and read this yourself, and hopefully you can understand how this is a similar case. And this final case is not with a demonstrative, for example, that ship or that man, but this final case involves a singular term that is a proper name. Okay. Now, here's how we can use the intuitions about these cases to argue against direct reference theory. So the first thing to note is that these cases I've given you are versions of Frege's puzzle, but that have arisen in communication. So given that the intuitive similarity of these cases to Frege's puzzle, we should expect that they can be used to argue against direct reference theory, which, again, direct reference theory is the view that the meaning of a singular term is just its referent. And the argument goes as follows. Premise 1. In order to understand a singular term, and so I put in parentheses here that we're talking about uses or tokens of a singular term, okay, because we also want to consider context-sensitive expressions like demonstratives, okay, but this qualification will be dropped for simplicity, okay. So in order to understand let me repeat this. Premise 1. In order to understand a singular term, more is required than thinking of the referent in any way whatsoever. So this premise is supported by intuitions from the cases that we just saw. Now, the second premise is as follows. The meaning of a singular term explains what is required in order to understand it. So this principle should remind you of the principle employed in the earlier arguments against direct reference theory, which talked about how the meaning of a term explains its cognitive value. So in short, here we're thinking about understanding as a kind of cognitive value. And so we say here that the meaning of a singular term explains what's required in order to understand it. Now, from these first two premises, we can get a sub-conclusion that the meaning of a singular term explains how, in understanding it, one must do more than think of the referent in any way whatsoever. Okay, so the first premise says that as a part of understanding a singular term, more is required than just thinking of the referent in some way. And the second premise says that it's the meaning of the singular term that explains what's required to understand it. So therefore, for this sub-conclusion, the meaning of a singular term explains how understanding involves more than just thinking of the referent in some way. Now, the fourth premise is an observation about direct reference theory, which is that if direct reference theory were correct, the meaning of a singular term could only explain that thinking of the referent in any way whatsoever is sufficient for understanding. And the reason why this holds is because, according to direct reference theory, the meaning of a singular term just is the referent. And so if the meaning just is the referent, that can only explain that all that matters for understanding just is thinking of that referent. And you can't say anything more about having to think of that referent in some particular way or some type of way, because all the meaning of the singular term just is that referent itself. So it can't say, the meaning can't explain why something more than just thinking of that referent is required to understand. So putting together the sub-conclusion theory that the meaning of a singular term has to explain how one must do more than think of the referent in any way whatsoever. So combining that with the idea that direct reference theory, because it only says that the meaning is the referent, it can't explain why more than thinking of the referent is required. It follows that direct reference theory is false. So, as an exercise, what you can do is reflect on which of these premises the direct reference theorist should or would deny. And hopefully by seeing the connection between understanding and cognitive value, as well as how it is that direct reference theorists responded to the other types of Frege puzzle challenges, hopefully it is clear how the direct reference theorists would begin to respond to this argument by denying one of the premises.